The neon lights of a Florida truck stop usually promise safety in the humid night. But along the lonely stretch of Interstate 75, that promise was a lie. Drivers thought they were picking up a helpless hitchhiker, a woman down on her luck. They were wrong. They were opening their doors to Aileen Wuornos. She wasn't the prey. She was the hunter. In the suffocating heat of the pines, the woman the press would call the Damsel of Death didn't just kill. She executed, turning the American open road into a slaughterhouse for 7 men who made one fatal mistake: stopping. The summer of 1990 in Florida was not just hot, it was oppressive, with a humidity that clung to the skin like a wet sheet. But for the Florida Highway Patrol, the heat wasn't the only thing rising from the asphalt. Along Interstate 75, a terrifying pattern was beginning to emerge from the pine forests and remote lovers' lanes that lined the state's central corridor. The discovery of the bodies began to paint a grim picture, not of random violence, but of a systematic hunting ground where the predators were usually the ones behind the wheel. Yet this time, the script had been flipped. On June 1st, the naked body of David Andrew Spears was discovered in a wooded area along Highway 19 in Citrus County. The brutality of the scene was immediately apparent to the investigators who arrived to swat away the flies and document the carnage. Spears had been shot 6 times with a .22 caliber pistol. Now, in the world of ballistics, a .22 is often considered a small, almost nuisance round, usually used for small game hunting or target practice. It lacks the stopping power of a larger caliber, which means that to kill a grown man, the shooter didn't just fire once or twice. They had to keep pulling the trigger until the job was done. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was an execution that required a terrifying amount of determination. Just as the police were trying to identify a suspect in the Spears case, the swamp gave up another secret miles away in Pasco County. The body of Charles Edmund Carskadden was found floating in a creek. Oddly enough, he had gone missing around the same time as Spears, but the Florida heat and water had accelerated the decomposition, making the medical examiner's job a nightmare. However, the bones told the story clearly enough. 9 bullets, 9 separate shots fired into his body, again with a .22 caliber weapon. The overkill was staggering. It suggested a killer who was either in a frenzy of rage or one who was meticulously ensuring that dead men told no tales. By August, the fear had migrated from the police briefings to the CB radios of the truckers crisscrossing the state. The long-haul drivers, the men who lived their lives in the cabs of 18-wheelers, began to whisper about a killer on the loose. Usually, the danger in this world was reserved for the hitchhikers or the sex workers, known in the industry as lot lizards. But now, the target was the drivers themselves. Troy Eugene Burris, a sausage delivery driver who was a family man and by all accounts a gentle soul, vanished during his route. His body was found days later in a ditch along State Road 19. He had been shot twice. The efficiency was increasing, but the weapon remained the same. Then came November and the discovery of Walter Gino Antonio. His body was found on a logging road in Dixie County, stripped naked just like Spears. He had been shot 4 times. The police were now staring at a serial killer profile that made no sense. The psychological profiling of the time suggested that a serial killer of this magnitude, operating with this level of violence against men, had to be a man, perhaps posing as a police officer or a stranded motorist. The idea that a lone woman could be responsible for dragging these bodies into the woods was almost inconceivable to the detectives leading the manhunt. And while they were looking for two men, or a dominant male with a female accomplice, the real killer was drinking beer in the biker bars of Volusia County, slipping completely under the radar simply because she didn't fit the mold of a monster. To understand how a drifter becomes a serial executioner, we have to rewind the tape back to the winter of 1989. Before the body count along I-75 began to spiral out of control, before the media dubbed her a monster, there was a cold night in November and a man named Richard Mallory. On November 30th, 1989, Richard Mallory was driving his Cadillac through Clearwater, Florida, when he saw a woman standing by the road. She was rough around the edges, with the weathered look of someone who had lived 100 lifetimes of bad luck in just 33 years. Aileen Wuornos got into his car and they drove to a secluded area for what was supposed to be a transactional encounter. But what happened next in those woods is the subject of one of the most heated debates in true crime history, and it serves as the pivotal moment where Aileen the survivor died and Aileen the killer was born. According to Aileen's confession, Mallory wasn't just a customer looking for a quick fix. She claimed that once they were isolated, his demeanor shifted entirely. She told investigators that he became violent, pulling a knife and brutally sexually assaulting her for hours. In that desperate struggle for survival, she managed to reach into her bag and pull out her .22 caliber pistol. She shot him in the chest. The bullet pierced his lung and heart, collapsing him onto the steering wheel. It was a messy, desperate act of violence that left a man dead and a woman standing over him, covered in blood and trauma. Here is where the story gets complicated, because if Aileen had left the car, walked to the nearest police station, and reported the attack, the outcome might have been very different. Subsequent investigations into Richard Mallory's past revealed that he was not the innocent victim his family believed him to be. He had served time in a Maryland prison for sexual assault. He had a history of violence that mirrored exactly what Aileen claimed he did to her. Under Florida law, even back then, the principle of self-defense is strong. If a jury had heard about his past and seen her injuries, she might have been acquitted. She might have been seen as a hero who took down a predator. But Aileen didn't go to the police. She didn't trust the system, a system that had failed her since she was a child. Instead, she made a fatal calculation. She dragged Mallory's body out of the car and covered it with carpet and brush. She wiped down the interior of the Cadillac, trying to scrub away the evidence of her existence, and then she drove off, later abandoning the car. She chose silence over justice, and in doing so, she crossed an invisible line. Psychologically, the killing of Richard Mallory unlocked something dark inside her. She realized that she had the power to stop the abuse, that she could be the one holding the gun. And as she drove away from that first crime scene, she wasn't just fleeing a murder charge. She was driving straight into a future where every man who picked her up would pay for the sins of the one who hurt her first. While the murders of Spears, Carskadden, and the others were creating a map of terror across the state, the police were still operating in silos, hampered by the lack of a central database and the sheer distance between crime scenes. They had bodies, but no killer. They had bullets, but no gun. What they desperately needed was a mistake, a slip-up that would bridge the gap between the ghost-haunting I-75 and the physical world. That mistake came in the form of a gray 1988 Pontiac Sunbird and a man who would never be found. In June 1990, right as the heat of the killing spree was intensifying, Peter Abraham Seams, a 65-year-old merchant seaman with a missionary's heart, was preparing to drive from Florida to Arkansas. He was a man of faith, the kind of person who believed in the inherent goodness of strangers, a belief that made him the perfect target for a predator who weaponized sympathy. Seams packed his car, said his goodbyes, and pulled onto the highway. He was never seen alive again. Unlike the other victims whose bodies were discarded in the woods to be found by hunters or passers-by, Seams simply vanished. To this day, his body remains one of the swamp's darkest secrets, a missing piece in a puzzle of flesh and bone. However, while Seams disappeared, his car did not. On July 4, 1990, in Orange Springs, Florida, a quiet rural community far removed from the interstate chaos, a massive crash shattered the afternoon silence. Witnesses watched as the gray Pontiac Sunbird careened off the road and slammed into a fence. But it wasn't the accident that caught their attention. It was the behavior of the occupants. Two women emerged from the wreckage. They weren't injured, but they were panicked. They didn't wait for the police. They didn't exchange insurance information. They grabbed their bags and fled into the Florida brush, leaving the twisted metal behind. When the Florida Highway Patrol arrived, they ran the plates and realized the car belonged to the missing Peter Seams. This was the breakthrough the task force had been praying for. For the first time, they had a crime scene that wasn't a decomposing body in the woods. They had a vehicle that the killer had lived in, driven, and touched. The car was towed to the crime lab, and the forensic technicians went to work with a level of scrutiny usually reserved for high-profile assassinations. They dusted every inch of that Pontiac, from the steering wheel to the rearview mirror. The car was a treasure trove of evidence. Unlike the meticulous cleaning of Richard Mallory's Cadillac, this car had been abandoned in a panic. Inside, they found a palm print on the interior door handle. It was a clear, perfect impression, the biological signature of the driver. This wasn't just a smudge, it was a roadmap to the killer's identity. But the evidence told another story, one that confused the profile even further. The witnesses at the crash site were adamant. They saw two women. Two. This shattered the lone gunman theory and the male serial killer profile. The police were now looking for a female duo, a Thelma and Louise from hell, who were leaving a trail of dead men in their wake. This evidence forced the detectives from Marion, Pasco, and Volusia counties to finally sit down at the same table. The jurisdictional lines that usually separated investigations began to blur as they realized they were all hunting the same phantom. The palm print from the Sunbird was run against the existing databases, but in 1990, the digitized systems we see on TV today were in their infancy. There was no immediate match. The killer was in the system, but not for murder. Not yet. The car gave them a direction, a gender, and a fingerprint, but it didn't give them a name. It did, however, start the clock ticking. Aileen Wuornos had abandoned the car, but she had left a piece of herself behind. And for the first time, the hunters were picking up the scent. But to truly understand the monster that stalked the highways of Florida in 1990, we cannot simply look at the gun or the forensic evidence. We have to look at the womb that birthed the violence. Aileen Wuornos was not created in a vacuum. She was forged in a fire of neglect and abuse that began long before she was even born. Her story is a tragic case study in the age-old debate of nature versus nurture. And in Aileen's case, both were poisoned from the very start. The story begins not in the humid swamps of the South, but in the cold industrial town of Rochester, Michigan, in the mid-1950s. Her biological father, Leo Pittman, was the stuff of nightmares. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a diagnosed schizophrenic with a history of child molestation. He was a man so disturbed that he was institutionalized, eventually hanging himself in a prison cell. Aileen never met him, yet his shadow loomed over her life like a genetic curse. There has always been a chilling question surrounding her psyche. Did she inherit the madness? Was the violence written into her DNA before she took her first breath? Her mother, Aileen Wuornos, was hardly more stable. She was a teenager, overwhelmed and unprepared for a child. When Aileen was just an infant, Diane abandoned her, leaving her and her brother Keith on the doorstep of her own parents. She walked away, leaving her children to be raised by the very people who had damaged her. This abandonment was the first crack in Aileen's foundation, a primal wound of rejection that would never heal. She was legally adopted by her grandparents, Laurie and Britta Wuornos, and for years she was told that they were her parents. It was a lie built on sand. The Wuornos household was a place where childhood went to die. Laurie, her grandfather, was a terrifying figure, an alcoholic with a violent temper who ruled the house with fear. Britta, her grandmother, was an enabler who drowned her own sorrows in the bottle. Instead of a sanctuary, Aileen grew up in a war zone. Neighbors would later recall seeing the children locked out of the house in the freezing Michigan winter, punishment for minor infractions. But the physical neglect was only the surface. Inside those walls, Aileen was subjected to sexual abuse from a young age, stripped of her innocence before she even knew what it meant. The trauma compounded when she was just 14 years old. Aileen became pregnant, a child carrying a child, the result of a rape that the community largely ignored. She was sent away to a home for unwed mothers, treated as a pariah, a shameful secret to be hidden away. She gave the baby up for adoption, another severance of connection, another loss in a life defined by them. By the time she was a teenager, the lie about her parentage had been revealed. She learned that her sister was her mother, and her parents were her grandparents. The betrayal was absolute, her identity shattered. Cast out by her family, living in the woods, trading her body for a warm meal or a pack of cigarettes, Aileen learned a single devastating lesson. She was worthless. She learned that men were predators, that love was a transaction, and that the only way to survive was to be harder, colder, and meaner than the world around her. She drifted from Michigan to Florida, carrying the baggage of Leo Pittman's madness and the scars of her grandfather's abuse. When she stood on the side of I-75 with her thumb out, she wasn't just a hitchhiker. She was a walking accumulation of rage, a biological time bomb that had been ticking since 1956, waiting for the right moment, and the wrong man, to finally explode. By the time Aileen Wuornos was 11 years old, the concept of a normal childhood had completely evaporated, replaced by a grim curriculum of survival that no sixth grader should ever have to study. While other girls her age in the quiet suburbs of Michigan were trading lunchbox snacks or worrying about math tests, Aileen was trading the only currency she had, her own body, for packs of cigarettes, food, or just a fleeting sense of worth. It wasn't a choice. It was a conditioning, a lesson drilled into her by the abuse at home that told her she was nothing more than an object to be used. The local boys knew her not as a classmate, but as the girl in the woods who would do anything for a little attention, a reputation that branded her with a scarlet letter before she even reached puberty. This trajectory of self-destruction accelerated at a terrifying speed. By 14, an age when the biggest milestone should be entering high school, Aileen was pregnant. In the conservative, judgmental atmosphere of the late 60s, an unwed teenage mother was a scandal that had to be erased. The system, rather than protecting the child who had been preyed upon, treated her as the problem. She was sent away to a home for unwed mothers, a sterile, cold institution designed to hide the shame of society. She gave birth to a son, but she was never allowed to be his mother. The baby was put up for adoption immediately, severing the one biological connection she had created. It was another abandonment in a life defined by them, reinforcing the belief that she was unfit to love or be loved. But the final blow came when she was 15. Her grandfather, Laurie, the man who had ruled her life with an iron fist and a belt, decided he had had enough. He didn't try to get her therapy. He didn't try to help her navigate the trauma she was drowning in. Instead, he kicked her out. He threw a 15-year-old girl out of the house and onto the street with nothing but the clothes on her back. For a time, Aileen lived in the woods near her old home, sleeping in an abandoned car, scavenging for food, and freezing in the Michigan cold. It was a feral existence. She was a teenage runaway in a country that was rapidly losing its social safety net, slipping through the cracks of a system that didn't know what to do with girls who didn't fit the mold. Those nights in the woods hardened her. She stopped looking for a savior and started looking for targets. She realized that civilization had no place for her, so she would live on its fringes, surviving by the laws of the jungle where the strong take from the weak. When the Michigan winter became too much to bear, Aileen did what so many lost souls in American history have done before her. She headed west and then south, hitting the highways that would eventually become her killing fields. But she didn't leave her demons back in the woods. She packed them in her suitcase. As she crossed state lines, her behavior shifted from desperate survival to reckless aggression. The sad, broken girl was beginning to calcify into a dangerous woman, and the law enforcement agencies of several states were about to get their first introduction to the name Aileen Wuornos, though she often hid behind a carousel of aliases. In May 1974, she surfaced in Jefferson County, Colorado, and the police report from that night reads like a warning sign that went unheeded. She wasn't arrested for vagrancy or shoplifting food. She was arrested for driving under the influence, firing a .22 caliber pistol from a moving vehicle. She was 18 years old, drunk, armed, and shooting blindly into the dark. It was a reckless display of nihilism. She didn't care if she hit someone. She didn't care if she crashed. She was angry at the world, and she was letting it know with bullets. This wasn't just a girl acting out. It was the behavior of someone who had zero regard for human life, including her own. She eventually drifted down to Florida, the Sunshine State, a place that attracts dreamers and drifters alike. In 1976, for a brief, bizarre moment, it looked like Aileen might actually escape her fate. She met Louis Gratz-Fell, a 69-year-old wealthy yacht club president. It was a mismatch of epic proportions, the 70-year-old high society man and the 20-year-old street survivor. They married and Aileen became Mrs. Fell. She had a home, money, and status. It was her chance at the American dream, a Pretty Woman scenario come to life. But you cannot simply erase 2 decades of trauma with a wedding ring. Aileen couldn't function in his world. The rage was always there, simmering just beneath the surface. The marriage imploded violently when Aileen grabbed her husband's own cane and beat him with it in a local bar. The assault was brutal and humiliating. Lewis Fell filed for a restraining order and annulled the marriage. Aileen was back on the street, but now she was bitter, having tasted the good life and lost it. From that point on, her rap sheet grew longer and darker. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was taking. She was arrested for armed robbery at a convenience store, holding a cashier at gunpoint for a handful of cash. She was caught forging checks, trying to steal identities, moving from town to town, leaving a trail of petty crimes and violence. She was creating a resume for a serial killer, learning how to use a gun, how to intimidate, and how to disappear. The justice system caught her, held her for a moment, and then released her back into the wild, failing to see the escalation. They saw a white trash drifter, a nuisance. They didn't see the predator growing inside her. By the late 80s, the transformation was complete. The girl from the Michigan woods was gone, replaced by a hardened criminal with a deep-seated hatred for men and a .22 pistol in her purse, waiting for a ride on Interstate 75. In the chaotic drift of her life, where faces were nothing more than targets or temporary distractions, Aileen Wuornos finally found something she had never really possessed: a home. But it wasn't a building with a white picket fence. It was a person. In June of 1986, Aileen walked into the Zodiac Bar in Daytona Beach, a dimly lit sanctuary for the local LGBTQ+ community. In the conservative South of the mid-'80s, places like the Zodiac were more than just watering holes. They were fortresses against a judgmental world, safe havens where outcasts could drop their guard. It was here, amidst the haze of cigarette smoke and the thump of the jukebox, that she met Tyria Moore. Tyria was everything Aileen was not. She was younger, softer, and possessed a kind of naivety that Aileen found intoxicating. Tyria hadn't been hardened by the streets. She hadn't been forged in the fire of abuse and abandonment that defined Aileen's existence. For the first time, the highway phantom felt a protective instinct that wasn't about self-preservation. She fell hard. They moved in together, and for a brief, flickering moment, Aileen tried to play house. She wanted to be the provider, the husband in the dynamic, the one who put food on the table and paid the rent. She wanted to give Tyria the stability that she herself had been denied. However, this domestic dream was built on a foundation of nightmares. To maintain this lifestyle, to keep Tyria happy and by her side, Aileen needed money. And the only way she knew how to make money was out on the highway. This relationship, which should have been her salvation, paradoxically became the fuel for her killing spree. The pressure to provide turned deadly. Every time cash ran low, Aileen would hit the road, the hunting ground, driven by a twisted sense of obligation. She wasn't just killing for rage anymore. She was killing to pay the bills. She was murdering men to buy beer, cigarettes, and moments of peace with the woman she loved. Tyria became the anchor in Aileen's storm, but she also became the unwitting accomplice to the carnage. When Aileen returned from the highway with items she had acquired, cameras, radar detectors, tools belonging to the dead men, It was often Tyria who walked into the pawn shops to convert them into cash. Whether she truly knew the blood-soaked origins of these trinkets or chose to look the other way in a state of willful blindness is a question that haunts the narrative. But in the eyes of the law, her signature on those pawn slips tied her inextricably to the crimes. Aileen had found her person, but in doing so, she had dragged an innocent, or at least a passive soul into the center of a homicide investigation. The love that Aileen thought would save her was actually spinning the very rope that would eventually hang her. As 1990 bled into 1991, the walls began to close in. The pawn tickets that Tyria had signed became the breadcrumbs that led the police right to their doorstep. The investigative task force, armed with the knowledge of the stolen goods and the palm print from Peter Siems's car, finally had a name. They tracked Tyria down to her sister's house in Pennsylvania. The police played their cards ruthlessly. They knew Tyria was the weak link. They offered her immunity in exchange for her cooperation, or they threatened to charge her as an accessory to multiple murders. Faced with the terrified prospect of the electric chair or life in prison, the anchor broke. Tyria agreed to help bring Aileen down. The stage for the final act was set at a place that couldn't have been more poetically named: The Last Resort. It was a gritty biker bar in Port Orange, Florida, a place where the air was thick with exhaust fumes, stale beer, and the roar of Harley-Davidsons. It was exactly the kind of rough-and-tumble joint where Aileen felt comfortable, where a woman with a hard stare and a pistol in her bag could blend into the background. On January 9th, 1991, the police knew she was there, but they didn't storm the building with SWAT teams and tear gas. They knew Aileen was armed and volatile. A direct confrontation in a crowded bar would turn into a bloodbath. Instead, the Volusia County Sheriff's deputies initiated a stealth takedown that felt more like a movie script than a police procedure. Undercover officers infiltrated the bar, sipping beers, watching her every move, waiting for the signal. The tension in the room was palpable only to those who knew what was coming. Aileen sat at the bar, nursing a drink, chatting with the regulars, completely unaware that the friends surrounding her were actually hunters in disguise. She was loud, she was brazen, and she was celebrating another day of survival, oblivious to the fact that her luck had finally run dry. When the moment came, it was swift and overwhelming. The Go team moved in. Before she could reach for the loaded .22 in her purse, the gun that had taken 7 lives, she was surrounded. "Police, don't move!" The shout cut through the noise of the bar. Hands grabbed her, pinning her arms, neutralizing the threat before a single shot could be fired. There was no shootout, no high-speed chase. The Damsel of Death, the woman who had terrorized the interstates of Florida, was handcuffed and dragged out into the flashing red and blue lights of the parking lot. As they put her in the back of the cruiser, Aileen Wuornos screamed, cursing the world that had birthed her. But deep down, she must have known this was the only way it could end. The open road was closed. The last resort had lived up to its name. Sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation room of the Volusia County Jail, Aileen Wuornos was a stone wall. The detectives had her in custody. They had the weapon, and they had the stolen goods. But Aileen wasn't talking. She knew the game. She had been dealing with law enforcement her entire life, and she knew that silence was her only shield. She sat there chain-smoking, cracking jokes, and seemingly unbothered by the gravity of her situation. The police quickly realized that intimidation wouldn't work on a woman who had already lived through hell. If they wanted a confession, if they wanted to close the books on the Florida highway phantom, they couldn't attack her fear. They had to use her love against her. The detectives turned their attention to the one weak point in Aileen's armor, Tyria Moore. In a separate room, the dynamic was entirely different. Tyria was terrified. She wasn't a hardened criminal. She was a woman caught in a nightmare she didn't have the strength to handle. The investigators played the classic good cop, bad cop strategy with a brutal efficiency. They told Tyria that she was looking at the electric chair. They told her that she would be charged as an accessory to multiple counts of first-degree murder because she had pawned the victim's belongings. But then they offered her a lifeline, total immunity, freedom. All she had to do was help them break Aileen. Tyria took the deal. It was a decision made out of self-preservation, but to Aileen, it would be the ultimate betrayal. The police set up a sting operation that was psychological torture disguised as procedure. They placed Tyria in a motel room and had her call Aileen at the jail, knowing that every word was being recorded. On January 16, 1991, the phone rang in the cell block. When Aileen picked up, she didn't hear a supportive partner. She heard a woman on the verge of a breakdown. Tyria, following the script given to her by the police, cried into the receiver. She told Aileen that the police were coming for her, that they were going to charge her with the murders, that her life was over. It was a performance designed to trigger Aileen's protective instincts, and it worked with devastating precision. Aileen Wuornos, the woman who hated the world, loved Tyria Moore enough to die for her. She couldn't bear the thought of Tyria going to prison for crimes she hadn't committed. Over the course of several phone calls, Aileen's resolve crumbled. She wasn't confessing because she felt guilt for the men she killed. She was confessing to save the only person who had ever made her feel human. In a voice thick with resignation, Aileen finally said the words the detectives were desperate to hear. She told Tyria to put the police on the line. She stated clearly that she had acted alone, that Tyria knew nothing, and that she was the one who pulled the trigger every single time. She handed the state their conviction on a silver platter, unaware that the woman she was sacrificing herself for was sitting in a room surrounded by cops, securing her own freedom at the cost of Aileen's life. The door to the cell clicked shut, not because the evidence was overwhelming, but because Aileen's heart was the one thing the system could use against her. The confession was the nail in the coffin, but the spectacle was just beginning. When Aileen Wuornos walked into the courtroom in 1992, she wasn't just a defendant. She was a media sensation. The press had branded her the first female serial killer, a title that was technically debated by criminologists, but irresistibly viral for the tabloids. The public was used to monsters looking like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy. They weren't prepared for a woman with wild hair and manic eyes who claimed she was the victim. The trial became a battle of two different stories. The defense team tried to paint a picture of a woman pushed to the brink. They brought up the childhood abuse, the abandonment, the rape, and the violent attack by Richard Mallory. They argued that Aileen was suffering from borderline personality disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, that she was killing in a state of delusional self-defense. They wanted the jury to see the human being beneath the mugshot. But the prosecution had a much simpler, more effective story. Cold-blooded robbery. They paraded the evidence, the pawn slips, the stolen cars, the methodical nature of the executions. They argued that Aileen wasn't a victim fighting back. She was a predator who lured men to their deaths for cash. And then there was Aileen herself. She was her own worst enemy on the stand. She was volatile, aggressive, and prone to outbursts that terrified the jury. At times, she would weep for her lost innocence. At other times, she would glare at the prosecutors with pure hatred. She eventually fired her attorneys, claiming they were incompetent, and essentially stopped fighting for her life. She changed her plea, admitting that while Mallory was self-defense, the others were just for gain. It was a slow form of suicide. The jury, composed of ordinary citizens, couldn't reconcile the two images of Aileen. In the American justice system, female defendants are often judged doubly hard, once for breaking the law and once for breaking the gender norms of nurturing and gentleness. Aileen Wuornos was the exact opposite of what a woman was supposed to be. On January 27, 1992, the gavel came down. Guilty. The judge sentenced her to death for the murder of Richard Mallory. Over the next year, she would receive 5 more death sentences. As the sentences were read, Aileen didn't beg for mercy. She raged. In one of the most chilling moments in courtroom history, she turned to the jury and the gallery, her eyes wide with a terrifying clarity, and screamed, "I'm an innocent person. I'll be up in heaven while you all rot in hell." It was the final roar of a woman who felt the entire world had conspired to destroy her from the moment she was born. The monster had been caged, but the questions she left behind regarding mental health, the failures of the system, and the nature of justice would haunt the courtroom long after she was led away to death row. For the next 10 years, the Broward Correctional Institution became both Aileen's home and her torture chamber. Death row in Florida is designed to be a place of quiet reflection before the end. But for Aileen Wuornos, it was a place where she slowly lost her mind. The rage that had fueled her killing spree didn't disappear behind bars. It turned inward, festering in the isolation of a 6x9 cell. As the years dragged on, the woman who had once stalked the highways with such arrogance began to lose her grip on reality entirely. Her correspondence and interviews from this decade paint a picture of a mind under siege. She became convinced that the prison guards were waging a secret war against her. She wasn't just complaining about bad food. She believed they were poisoning her meals, spitting in her coffee to infect her with diseases, and turning down the heat to freeze her to death. But the paranoia went deeper than physical abuse. Aileen claimed that the prison staff was using sonic pressure devices to control her thoughts, to manipulate her brainwaves, and to force her into madness. She spoke of cameras hidden in the walls and conspiracies that reached the highest levels of government. To the outside world, she sounded like a raving lunatic. But psychiatrists saw something more specific. Evaluations conducted during her incarceration revealed a terrifying landscape within her psyche. She was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, a condition characterized by unstable moods and a fragmented sense of self. But the number that truly chilled the experts was her score on the Hare psychopathy checklist. A score of 30 is the threshold for being a psychopath. Aileen scored a 32. This placed her on the same level as the most dangerous predators in history, incapable of true empathy, manipulative, and fundamentally detached from the moral consequences of her actions. Yet, unlike the cold, calculating psychopaths who blend in, Aileen was a firestorm of emotion, a disorganized offender whose brain was a chaotic mix of trauma and malice. As the new millennium dawned, the legal battles surrounding her fate reached a stalemate. Her lawyers, desperate to save her life, argued that she was mentally incompetent. They said that executing a woman who believed in sonic mind control was a violation of the Constitution. They wanted to fight on, to drag the process out for decades. But Aileen was done. In a final act of defiance, or perhaps exhaustion, she petitioned the Florida Supreme Court to fire her lawyers and drop all her appeals. She wrote letters stating she was tired of this world and the filthy lies. She accused the system of using her as a pawn and declared that she wanted the state to kill her. It was a form of suicide by executioner. She looked at the machinery of death, not with fear, but with impatience. She wanted to leave the cage, even if the only way out was in a body bag. On the morning of October 9, 2002, the long road that began in the freezing woods of Michigan and wound through the humid highways of Florida finally came to an end. At 9:47 a.m., Aileen Wuornos was strapped to the gurney at the Florida State Prison. The witnesses, reporters, officials, and the ghosts of her past watched through the glass. There was no terror in her eyes, only a bizarre, manic clarity. When asked for her final words, she didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't address the families of the men she killed. Instead, she delivered a message that was equal parts cryptic and defiant, a final transmission from a mind that had long since departed this reality. I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back. Minutes later, the lethal cocktail of chemicals stopped her heart. The highway phantom was gone. But Aileen Wuornos did not disappear. In a strange twist, her death only solidified her status as an icon of American darkness. Just a year later, the film Monster was released, with Charlize Theron delivering a haunting performance that forced the world to look at Aileen not just as a killer, but as a human being destroyed by circumstance. It sparked a national conversation that continues to this day. Was she a cold-blooded predator who deserved to die? Or was she a victim of a society that threw her away? A monster created by the very violence she inflicted? Her story remains a dark stain on the American dream, a reminder that on the lonely stretches of the interstate, the line between hunter and hunted is thinner than we think. We look for monsters under the bed, but sometimes they are just broken people standing by the side of the road, waiting for a ride. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the abyss. This story is a heavy one, but it's one that needs to be told. If you found this investigation compelling, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Stay safe, trust your instincts, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.